Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Phil Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss what actually is health, and does public health exist? Tim.
A lot of left-wing intellectuals, as well as even minarchists and many classical liberals, will argue the state ought to play a role, if of course the state should exist. The state ought to play a role to regulate and at times intervene, if not outright control, public health. In our Ed Feser episode, one of the criticisms I've made is that Feser seems to think the state has certain rights, duties, in a similar vein to Hayek's muddled minarchism, but those exceptions one can drive a truck through. And the exceptions, of course, are pandemics, defense, air, water, climate, the climates, and, of course, health. Well, of course, pandemics are part of health. Security might be the other major exception, but health is probably the big area of growth. And since we've been on this podcast, it's one of our focuses here on pandemic policy. But this is not just new, because you can see this show up in other areas, in like the safety culture and other areas. When someone was visiting Julian Assange, they can't have hot coffee because Assange might use it as a weapon. You do it for your own safety. It's done for your own safety. It's done for your own health and safety. So health and safety becomes a justification by the state and authorities to do all sorts of things. So in what Keith Preston would call totalitarian humanism or the pink state, it makes health its raison d'etre. It also implicitly shows up in why the left will never abolish our episodes. Why the left will never abolish the state episode we did probably in 2020. That was one of our early episodes here. And, again, how can you fight pandemics, which involve lots of millions of people, billions of people disagree, without a large state, if not a one world government here? And this is where you quickly get into sort of Alex Jones territory here, one world government territory, new world order. Again, and this is not necessarily a totally conspiracy theory, because even people like Max Blumenthal would argue that, although he's increasingly in Jimmy Dore. And so a lot of the true lefties, in a sense, have more agreement than they admit. I'd argue that in ways the current state, moving on, I'd argue in a way the current state in various areas from lockdowns, leading to increases in obesity, bad health pyramids, promotion of carbs, and many other areas, is the best at neutral, if not contra health, especially in the Mulbuggian state. So if you want an effective state, if your goal is an effective state, the current state doesn't seem to promote it. One of the downfalls of one of the things pointed out by many lockdown skeptics was if you close gyms, if you close sporting events, and you close youth sports and things like that, people aren't going to be out exercising, and all, they're going to become fatter. And again, I'm not against fat people, believe it or not. I think they can be quite, Tim Dillon. I think there's a lot of funny, but it's not being, it is a comorbidity here, so to speak. And it's also a problem for diabetes. It's a problem for health costs. So the current state, much to the contra left wing, seems to promote unhealth. And I myself like to consider myself quote unquote healthy or pro-health, not just in physical ways, but eating too. This is something I think I agree in some sense with the food snobs. Brian Kaplan and Elizabeth Brunig had a debate over this, and Brian Kaplan was like, McDonald's is great. And the food snobs would cringe at that. But then I was like McDonald's, the food snobs correctly would cringe is unhealthy at times, but everything can be unhealthy in moderation here. So and again, I'm somewhat disagreeing with the paleocons, some of the paleocons. I think environmentalists tend to be deep paleocons, and we've improved our environment to make it better for humans. Like most fruit and vegetables are nothing to look like what were 300 years ago. There's an example here. Also, having CO2 might improve plants and vegetables as well. And many of the foods are minimally picked and selectively bred, if not GMO bred. Now you can get into those rabbit holes there. And then meat consumption is up. In the past, people would meat consumption in Britain was something like 87 pounds in 1830s to 132 pounds in 1900s. Americans today eat 220 pounds of meat on average. Meat is generally quite good for you. This is what Jordan Peterson diet he's famous for. He only eats meat. Whether he continues to only eat meat is a good question. But it is quite clear, like one of the things you show up when the French and Spanish showed up onto the coasts of America or the Pacific Northwest, they ran into these natives, and all they would eat is like fresh fish and like vegetables. This is where the paleo diet comes in, and they were in like great health. So I'm in a sense in agreement with the paleocons on diet, but if you want to do it widespread, then I'm not at all. The environmentalists and paleocons in that sense are total. By paleocons, I mean people like Roger Scruton or some of them. That's what I mean by that. I want to quick clarify that. I don't mean Murray Rothbard or Lou Rockwell. I want to quick clarify that. So that's my sort of opening treatise against this. I don't think the state is pro-health in the real sense, in the thick sense. In the thin, narrow sense, it claims it's about health. It does, but a lot of that is just, propaganda to justify its power or to justify bad products. But I'm not against health. I think people should try to be healthy. I think it's generally a good. And that would be my opening question here, Swithin. That's my opening statement here. My opening question is, one of the key questions one ought to ask is, what is public health, or what is health general? And what do you make of my comments here on the opening, my opening statement here on the relationship between the current pink totalitarian humanist state and public health? Swithin?
Well, it's pretty clear that the current state has no interest in health in any way, in any genuine shape or form. Any appeal to health is merely a pretext. They have no underlying concept of what health is or how to achieve it. It's just a pretext to do what they want to do. It's the same way. Oh, there's another school shooting in America. Oh no, gun control. It's like, did you really change your view as to what should happen with guns because of the school shooting? No, of course you didn't. It's just a pretext to go on the same old talking points. I mean, if you look at the history of sort of like health, inverted commas, and especially in the post-Second World War period, the state was involved in making things worse. I mean, you look at the history of the food pyramid and the number of grains used, and now as to how it got to things with respect to subsidies for grain farmers and stuff, and they wanted it in there. And you get certain types of industrialization of farming, which was considered generally bad. Well, environmentally, like in England, for instance, you had destruction of hedgerows and various things, because the goal of the state post Second World War was food security. In the Second World War, the major battle that Britain fought was the Battle of the Atlantic, more than the Battle of Britain, because we were a massive food importer. And so the goal was sort of increasing food consumption and production. Now, you could say, well, obviously that's related to health to some extent. But I mean, it wasn't really health as such. You could argue it was basically a defense security measure. So I simply don't buy. Well, I suppose what the UK government is interested in is trying to reduce strain on the NHS. And so insofar that's the case, they care about public health. But if it's a case whereby we can say, oh, well, you're unhealthy because it's your own fault, well, then we won't treat you, which they increasingly can do, especially with smokers. And so in that sense, they don't particularly care. They should just care about them not a drain on public finances. But then the question arises, what is health? So what the governments will tend to do, so you mentioned like fat people, they'll go on the BMI measure. But the BMI, from memory, was created by some statistician. It doesn't actually have any genuine sort of medical basis. Because as you may be aware, you get people like the 18-stone heavyweight boxer is somehow obese. It's like something's a bit wrong here with this measurement. Now, people claim there's other things as well. But one of the problems, and this is why, in the sense of public health, which is a problem, is that there's no such thing as the generic human. What is heavy for somebody is not heavy for somebody else, and it depends on body shape and size, etc. Because there's no real standard body to measure it against, which is why things like the BMI index don't make any sense. There was an interesting YouTube video, and a guy was saying how one of the problems is with public health, they've taken a sort of post sort of enlightenment sort of approach, and or one of mechanism whereby humans are just machines, and there's this ideal thing, and then you're just going to fit this blueprint. Where in fact, people are all different. You've got to look at individuals and how he's a cardiologist, and how this heart might be slightly bigger in one certain area than normal, inverted commas. But then I go, well, the other side's the same size, so it's probably all right, because you want to look at harmony and form and measure it against sort of like the individual rather than sort of generic healthy human. And obviously, what does health mean? You're physically generally fit. You have good locomotive ability to a large extent, and you can breathe easily. You can do what you would generally want to do in life without being interfered with your body not working properly. Then the question is, when it comes to public health, I mean, to have okay, so there's a couple of ways you could do this. You could say public health is merely a shorthand to individual members, and so public health doesn't really exist as such. It's just merely a shorthand for individual health. If you wanted to have a more robust concept of public health, you'd have to kind of treat the public as the political community as some sort of like genuine social object that has sort of genuine existence. And how you do this probably have something about, well, there's some irreducible relations between people, and how and for this reason that there is it has some sort of genuine existence. So in a sense, you could argue that the public, in a sense, has an analogy maybe to say like the family. So for instance, you could argue and say in one sense that the family exists prior to the individual, in that, well, the individual can't exist apart from the family because, well, where does he come from? Now, of course, you could argue it's a special creation of God or something. But in that sense, you can't exist without having parents. So you could make that kind of claim. Then the question is, well, what would actually public health mean? Well, I mean, you would want the population is generally sort of, as I mentioned, sort of fit and healthy. Although I think it was just with terminal philosophy. It was probably on the drugs episode. It does seem to be the case that currently the ruling elite wants people to be sort of hyped up for work, and then when they're in leisure time, just going to dumb them down and fill them with drugs and sort of, or you could say like junk food type things, just to sort of mean that they are not sort of politically active or revolutionary in any way. But just to generally speaking, though, but I mean, public health in general, you could say is just individual health. But as well, though, you could make the argument that genuine public health was actually a society that can reproduce itself, because if an organism is getting smaller in a way that tends to be a bad thing, if you get under a certain weight. So you could argue that public health would include sort of like getting replacement rate fertility, which the UK and the US have got nowhere to do. So you could add that there. I suppose as well, you could make the case that we mentioned sort of pandemics, that having sort of serious communicable diseases that could incapacitate a large proportion of the population for a long time could destabilize the internal order of the community. And so therefore preventing those may be something that could be genuinely considered part of public health. But really the idea of public health really is individual health writ large, with probably exception, with the possible additions of fertility rates and preventing outbreaks of communicable diseases which somehow harm the internal cohesion of that kind of body. That'd be my sort of approach to health and what you might consider as public health.
I have a number of questions here, but I'm going to first skip to question 4 here. And one of the things oftentimes associated with health is hospitals. And hospitals are these sort of giant factories. You get this sort of the birth of Michel Foucault's Birth of a Clinic. You also get this with other thinkers as well. The hospitals sort of grew up in the industrial era, because back in the day we used to have home doctors. Now home doctors come with problems here, but the hospital as a centralized organization to place people. This is an invention of the Industrial Revolution largely, or an outgrowth of industrialized militaries, where you have the field hospital here. You have a bunch of casualties in the field hospital here. But really, you start to see these. The Quakers sort of had these with medical as well as mental as well. But it was sort of like a retreat. And it's finally enough, as I think Matt really and Nassim Taleb both pointed this out, like the sort of heuristic of sending, disease patients to the countryside for fresh air was probably entirely correct heuristic here. So the fact that the hospital was like located on some country estate, this was probably good for mental and physical health. But this is more of a heuristical understanding of health here. But hospitals look like factories. They look like factory institutions. They're boxed up. They have an assembly line mechanism, a receiving area, a distribution center. They have standardized qualifications. So my question here is, and I'm definitely in the negative on this. Are hospitals good for public health? One of the statements, one of the statements you can make is people go to hospitals to die, and I think in a sense it's true. Now, partly that's for legal and insurance reasons, rather than some people just say, I think my grandfather actually died at home, but the ambulance took him there to say he's died at the hospital. So there is a certain sense where, and many people don't want end-of-life care at hospitals. There's an interesting article of how do doctors die. And as much as they're opposed, as much as they might claim that they want these advanced medicines and end-of-life procedures, they don't. They themselves die generally peacefully away from these things. If they have a terminal communicable, if they have a terminal disease or some disease that in a sense will shorten their lifespan based on an average lifespan. So some forms of brain cancer and so forth. So I'm suspicious of hospitals. I'm suspicious of doctors. So going into this pandemic before 2020, I was already suspect. I was suspect in 2019 of them. I was disappointed how Nassim Taleb took a very statist, industrial turn for policies here, because I've learned a lot of sort of the intergenics arguments from him. There's a lot of procedures historically that probably killed people, famously bleeding, or were neutral. They're famously bleeding, but there's also other medical procedures you could name. There's certain dental procedures you could argue, and so forth here. And there's some, health guru YouTubers that get called grifters, but they'll say things like, well, if people stopped, eating, inflammatory food, diabetes would go away, or things like if people stop eating sugar or just fasted once a week, or it's like very simple health hacks, they would cut the diabetes rate. And it is true. I mean, there was Gary Taubes, Why We Get Fat. Like Japanese people don't get, and I'm not saying this is an ethnic stereotype, but they don't get diabetes. They don't get type 2 diabetes, supposedly. Now, why is that? Well, that's the environment. But, let's have an expensive insulin system. And this is an agreement I might have with the far left, so to speak. But the solution for that is not to subsidize insulin production. The solution is to change. The cheapest solution would be to change one's diet here. So in a sense, that requires discipline. But this also goes back to intergenics. There is a tendency in our sort of I would call it scientism culture, where we just refer to doctors as kind of like the white coat priests who are there to fix us or save our bodies, so to speak, from decay. And the hospital in particular is, I would argue, the center of that. And it's a very statist institution. And it's been more or less, there are some non-statist forms of it, like the Quakers example, but once around the 1900s worldwide, hospitals just get taken over and regulated by the state. What do you make of hospitals here? Do you broadly agree with my criticism of hospital? Again, if you break your leg, if I break my leg, I want to go to a hospital. If I get into a car, I want to go to a hospital. If I get in a major accident like that, I want to go to a hospital. I agree. That kind of care is great. I think that is excellent. The problem is the long-term care, the care for like terminal diseases. That is a crap show, and I think they're very off base. So I don't think they're related to health, although it's commonly related to health. And do you agree with my overall comments, Swithin?
Well, clearly, yes, essentially. As the current medical system is set up, it is very factory-like. Humans are standardized products, and you have to do things the right way. I mean, there's loads of stories of people telling doctors and nurses and stuff like, so I remember hearing one, a woman goes into labor into hospital and a certain level of dilation, and they go, oh, you don't need to worry about that, I'll be ages before it comes. Like, She's had like 2 before. They come out in like 20 minutes after this stage. Oh, no, it's going to be fine. And then, oh, wait, the baby has arrived after 20 minutes. Other ones, like a guy I know of, he monitored his heart rate, and it was about 80 beats a minute. And the doctor said, "Oh, it's within normal bounds." But he was like, "Look, no, it's not. It is way higher than it normally is. This is wrong." And then basically has to lie his way to getting a test. And then, oh wait, there was something wrong with him. This is the problem with the healthcare system, and it is, as you see, becomes industrialized. And as mentioned before, it's like the standardized human. And this is the big issue with it. And it treats people as basically standardized machines. And also with hospitals to a large extent are the most depressing places to be. And it's like, why not try and make hospitals nice places to be? Now, obviously, you could say in that sense people might want to go there, but it might aid recovery because you kind of know that humans aren't kind of just like machines that need to go to the garage to get fixed. Another thing as well in hospitals, which is really bad, is the diet that they feed the, I'm going to say inmates, patients is abysmal. It's highly, so for instance, it's not entirely surprising that a lot of, again, related to it, or not exactly the same, like nursing homes, not surprising that everyone in nursing homes collapsed and died due to a certain, or potentially due to a certain virus, or it could have been midazolam. Because the diet they eat is terrible. So it's not surprising that the health is really bad when they're in a nursing home. They go there because they eat terrible stuff. So, yeah, I mean, as they're currently constituted, no, they're not. I mean, hospitals are huge to a large extent. There had been some private ones that, like I think some private cancer hospitals in America came up, and basically they were regulated out of existence. I think if you had a non-statist healthcare system, what you're likely to have was significantly small hospitals, ones that are actually probably more nice to be there because people might, well, for instance, if you were buying your healthcare and you could, and obviously it depends on the price difference, but one that kind of looks like, like a house to some extent. It feels nice being there. You can go to see the garden, or you can converse with other people. That might actually be a place that people will pay a little bit more to go to, but they might not. But I would imagine that there'll be more options like this. And since you're actually be the genuine patient and you'll be buying stuff, the too long to go into, but the third party paying system in the insurance in the US just makes no sense. It's just a scam. It seems to be from what I've read. If anyone wants to listen more about the Free Market Medical Association, do some interesting stuff on that as a reference point. But if you're the genuine customer, you're going to get more individualized, non-factory style healthcare. I mean, it is possible, of course, at certain times the factory style one would have been the cheapest thing to do. In the same way that you could argue that off-the-rack suits were the most efficient thing to do. But I mean, today with modern technology, you're getting a lot more made-to-measure stuff. So in other areas which were mass-produced now aren't. So you could see that. So yeah, I'm very much in agreement with you that their places die. And also we've been with doctors, and they don't take all these drugs. Well, the thing is, it's in their financial interest to give people all these drugs because the drug companies, they might pay them, or indirectly there may not be direct corruption there. I'm not exactly sure how that would work directly in the US, but certainly doctors want to look like they can do something for you. They probably don't want to say, oh yeah, actually probably best not taking anything that I can sell you, and you're best off just dying a few months earlier. What doctors want to do is try and sell people to live longer. And so I think their incentive structure is just to sell stuff that isn't very good in that regard. That said, I mean, if you did have doctors who actually knew you and got to know you more, like as it's historically kind of argued, historic sort of family doctor does in the UK, then that might change. But that would have to be a situation where the doctor knew you more as a person rather than just as a patient number. But I would say to a large degree, your criticisms of the medical system are entirely correct.
On a slight personal, I probably have only been to the hospital once in the past, 12 years. And that was, I probably shouldn't have gone. I had hand, foot, mouth disease and I was running a high fever. So I thought it'd be a good idea. But I think overall it was a mistake to go insofar as they didn't really do anything, which is, again, they'll point that out. So there's lots of things that they don't, maybe you shouldn't go. Even so, like, in a sense, one of the weird things about the American system here is many people in my health bracket, have no choice but to be healthy insofar as, well, we don't have the best insurance and, well, we could pay more to get it, but it's not really designed for us. It's designed at this point, the system is designed for the elderly, like elderly, the sick, and those like the people with lots of comorbidities, or if you get the occasional broken leg, those type of things. Again, but then to be fair, and not to get into Graham Hancock territory here, but it could be the case that historically, like, certain groups knew how to bind broken bones. Now, again, were they as clean as us? Like germ theory, I think germ theory is a relatively good idea. Whether it's mass hand sanitizer is a good idea it's a good question. I don't generally use that stuff at all. But those type of things, I'm totally agreeing with hospitals. That kind of, like, accidents, those type of things. But the other stuff, no. So moving on here, I'm gonna go back into the areas of the state here, because we're speaking of public health, and is there a separation between private and public? Oftentimes, under normal conversations, that institution that links the public and the private is the state. Now, you may disagree with it. You may think that should go away. And again, we're both, in a sense, anarchists here. So we do think the state should be abolished here. And there's some question, what would an ideal healthcare system look like? And we somewhat did that. And how much would an ideal society pay for healthcare? We did that episode maybe 10 episodes ago here. So that's not really the question here. But in our current society here, we have the state. And oftentimes when you have the public means state health. And I would say, and my question for you is the state opposed to public health by promoting a certain lifestyle, or de facto promoting a certain lifestyle? And I'm going to ask you that question, but I'm going to outline my answer here. And my answer is no. Now, you saw that with the coronavirus pandemic, the COVID-19 thing, where they obviously did not. They told people to be inside. They couldn't get vitamin D. They went out against different treatments. The closing down of social and physical exercises. That's not good for other types of health. And now, I mean, again, there's certain articles that run where they point this out, but this was all pointed out by us in our episode 1, by the way. So in that regard, we were totally right. But it was also pointed out by some random lots of other people here too. So we're not the only ones who pointed this out. It was fairly obvious, unless you were, living under a rock, so to speak. So that's my outline of the answer. And this is not new either. You brought up the example of the health pyramids here, the high fructose corn syrup subsidies that exist in the United States that make sugar not available here. So now we just to flavor all our drinks with corn, and that's some of the corn lobby, some of it's a health thing. You want to ban sugar, but but people still want sweet things, so they just create other sweeteners here. And sugar might have actually been better. If you're going to have sweet things, you may as well just have sugar. So that's my overall answer here to the state promote health. Does the state promote a healthy lifestyle? No. What do you think? What do you make of that question, Swithin? Do you think the state promotes a healthy, air quotes, lifestyle, or is it contra health? What do you make of it?
The state promotes anything that's in its own interest. And so then the question is, to what extent is promoting a healthy population in its interest? I would say that the state's main goal was to increase its tax revenues and its power. The question is, how do you do that? So for one thing, the way in which the state has increased its power, particularly, is, what about the children? What about the children? So it's actually in the state's interest, and has basically policy with the welfare system predominantly since the 1960s, basically made it more financially viable for unmarried women to have children. And then go on about, how much poverty they're in, how much subsidy they need. Is this going to create a good, healthy upbringing for the children? No, of course it's not. Do they care? No. Why? Because it's going to increase their power base. So I think that's pretty clear. Now, to some extent, promoting a healthy population is going to be useful. I mean, to some extent, you're going to want soldiers who are reasonably fit and able to fight. And, you can't have the population being too ill. But again, though, there's one of short-term benefits and long-term costs. I mean, the short-term benefits of messing up with the kids is you can increase your power, and they just become a problem over the next 18 years or so. It seems to me to be not obvious that they're in favour of health, and it's clear that with the coronavirus stuff that they were not interested in health. Why, as you mentioned, why close down all the gyms and swimming pools? And they actively suppressed information everybody knew to be true. So Matt Hancock, who was the health secretary at the time in Parliament, said, there was no evidence that vitamin D made any difference to coronavirus results and in severity of symptoms. And you could see, like, from April 2020, I remember reading articles on, like, you look at the vitamin D count of people who got it badly and people didn't. It was blatantly obvious. And also, you mentioned field hospitals in the Spanish flu, the people who got more sunlight and were in more outdoory kind of hospitals did a lot better. And that's one of the problems with a lot of there's an old hospital nearest where my parents live. I think they still have like an outdoor section, because one of the ideas was you needed fresh air, and so it was like a veranda, and a lot of the patients were out there. It was just had a covered area, so it was as if they were like a stage, like a film set, and where the cameras would be was the outside. But then that was all changed with, I think, was it the antibiotics coming in? Or maybe germ theory to some extent, because one of the arguments in the 19th century is why people got ill was bad air, and that's why you needed, I think Florence Nightingale believed that. And so you needed sort of good airflow. And you're right about the sweet things. I mean, to some extent you say it's unintended consequences, but whether it is unintended is another question. I mean, one of the worst taxes ever introduced in England is the sugar tax. It just made everything taste terrible, because it's almost impossible to get a sugary drink that doesn't have artificial sweetener in. Now, I'm not necessarily somebody who says artificial sweetener is necessarily bad. They just taste terrible. But I am aware that they've been associated with increased risks of cancer, particularly aspartame. And also I remember hearing an anecdotal story about how some girl had a really bad gut issue, and then the doctor didn't know what to do. She stopped drinking Diet Coke and it got better. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be the artificial sweeteners in the Coke than anything else. It's clear that the state has an interest in health insofar as it advances its own power and prestige and interest. And everything, the things it does is pretext, as I mentioned earlier. I see no principled position. There may be people who are adjoining to the ruling class who actually believe certain things, and they get certain privileges. Well, they don't get privileges. They get policies they want, and because they have sufficient influence. Now, I suppose you could argue that the state wanted to stop smoking because it was bad, because they did lose a lot of tax revenue from it, I think. But I'm not sure on the smoking numbers and how that's changed. Be interested to see how you could make a claim that, well, one of the claims as to why you actually banned tobacco advertising, for instance, in the UK was Sean Gabb argued that one of the, he reckoned that it was possibly one of the advocated for by the tobacco companies because it saved lots of money in advertising, because the market was basically saturated, it wasn't growing, and so it was just a case of increasing market share. So if nobody could advertise, it would mean that no new entrants could come in, which is entirely possible. Another aspect as well, though, when it comes to the anti-smoking stuff, I think to a large extent it was class warfare. It was basically at that point in the 90s, it was the lower classes that smoked, and they weren't the right type of people. They were probably Yeah, I mean, some of them would have been sort of like patriotic white working class types, and the middle and upper middle classes don't like them, and so they'll probably justify it by themselves. We're trying to make their lives better, but actually, it was just a case of class warfare, which to a large extent lockdowns were class warfare. The people who imposed the policy bore almost zero costs. So I think you've got smoking are probably the best example of something you could argue that the state did because it was in the interest of the health of the population. But upon a closer analysis, I don't think it's as clear as it may seem on first glance.
With respect to the smoking example, one of the things that St. George Floyd, LOL, St. George Floyd, LOL, was buying was cigarettes. And one of the reasons cigarettes are very expensive here, precisely because of the tax revenue and precisely because of the sort of war on cigarettes. I never smoke. I'm not really interested in doing it. So in that respect, I'm sort of I'm agnostic on that issue in general. Although I've become suspicious of it. Ayn Rand was very pro smoking, by the way, but I wouldn't advocate it myself. I wouldn't want anyone to do it. So that'd be my opinion. But again, I don't necessarily promote it on everybody. And my final question here, Swithin, we've gotten to a lot of stuff, and if you want to add things, please do. You made a joke here. Speaking of agnosticism, you made a joke once that said you're a public health non-cognitivist. I thought this was pretty good. You somewhat explained it in private here. What do you mean by that, Swithin?
Oh, all I meant by that is it's just a meaningless phrase. It's like moral non-cognitivism. Being, morality doesn't exist. I take the same view of public health. I mean, it's alleged to be some sort of, clear scientific idea, but it's just a political concept. And also with public health as well, you can broaden it so far. This is a topic in and of itself. We get like mental illness and to what extent are radical views being propagated bad for public health? Public mental health. It's just a ridiculous term. Is it the Great Barrington people complain that oh no, all this lockdown stuff is going to give public health a bad name? It's like, well, it deserves a bad name because it makes no sense in the way in which it's used. I mean, I think there are senses in which you could salvage a concept of public health, but the public health is used as just an excuse for busybodies in the managerial elite to tell other people what to do. And that's all it's there for. And I'd be surprised if it was ever anything other than that. Now, my knowledge of medical history isn't good enough to say that with certainty, but I certainly think that's I have reasons to believe why that may be true.
Public health, the phrase public health is oftentimes used against libertarians. And as I stated in my opening statement, people like Hayek, the minarchist Phaser, will give public health a pass for the state. I don't think, speaking of skin in the game and incentives, you were saying that Hancock didn't really sense any consequences here, and the Barrington people were complaining about public health gets a bad name. I think that's good. It's good they get a bad name. One of the things, well, actually ended up being slightly, a hospital shooting happened recently. Turns out the guy, now again, in this one it's much more interesting here, but he was complaining his back didn't heal quickly enough or something like that. So he went in and just shot the dog. And I see these type of things. I think in general, I'm not advocating any violence here. So I want to state that here, YouTube. Not that anyone really listens much significance yet. But there is a time that lack of skin in the game. I brought up St. George Floyd. There is a kind of immunity that exists for doctors, that exists for other things. Like, I have some people on Facebook advocate getting the vaccine here, and they of course were MDs or podiatrists or dentists, and they were like they were using their authority, their sort of professional clout to make an opinion on it. And it was like, okay, if this thing goes bad, do I get to not knock your down 2 slices? And they're like, well, So it's like, you're just saying what the state propaganda says. You're not really saying nothing about your degree in dentistry or your degree in child or whatever really affects this thing. And actually, in a sense, we both have enough reading comprehension skills to read the papers that do exist. So yeah, I agree that the public health should get a bad name, partly because, as you stated, it doesn't really exist in its pretext, but partly because I think in this sense it's a private matter. And I think the libertarians, again, now you can go and there's other areas here. Funnily enough, the My Body, My Choice now polls badly because liberal Democrats here in the United States associate with the anti-lockdowners, funnily enough. But I do, in some sense, buy that premise on a lot of levels, and I do think health issues. Now, bad air, I agree in the sense that bad air is a problem. But even there, this is where the Coase theorem comes in interesting things. Like, pollution happened for a reason insofar as it made us richer. Like if you're going to say pollution has made everyone worse off, well, you have to sort of you have to think about what would be the alternative world where we don't burn fossil fuels. And in that world, as David Friedman or Alex Brunson points out, we all starve to death because we can't have nitrogen in our soils or enriched soils and fertilizers, and we can't have, all sorts of other things, as well as like cars and TVs and all those wonderful modern technology. I make some agreements here. You can't have it without fossil fuels and without lots of power. So maybe we can get it from the sun eventually through solar, but we've yet to. So at this point in the day, even if you complain about air pollution or things like that, and you can make local air better, but if you want to make the all air around the world good, you need a world government here. If you're really going to tackle this thing here, so even there, it's just a giant power grab here. And then to go back to the incentive structures, if these people are so far, let's go back to incentive structures and skin in the game. If these people are so far away from it, the state, whether the local state or the big state, they have no reason to change it because they can. If it's really bad, they'll just escape it. In all likelihood, unless we do all starve to death, then they might not escape it here. But that would be my overall comment here. The state just seems ill-equipped for a variety of reasons, notably the incentive structure here. So in this regard, the Barrington people should be glad that public health gets a bad name. It should have a bad name because it doesn't really exist here, and that much of the health things that we talk about could be done privately. And what's annoying, I'll add one more comment. What's annoying about the left here, and this was pointed out, Peter Hitchens and that was on a channel related to Ben Burgess, Sublation Media. And following up, Peter Hitchens was on there. It's an old episode. It's pretty good. And early on in the lockdown, it's worth pointing out that one of the arguments that some libertarians was made is that, and I actually agree with this, that we don't owe each other all this stuff. This is sort of a Randian argument here. Now, Peter Hitchens is sort of anti this, so this is sort of a weak spot here. So they were asking about this, and I think no, we don't. There's a limit of how much we actually owe other people here. In a sense, this is sort of the child drowning the fountain. If he's drowning the fountain, you can swim. Go save the child. But at some point, you have other things to do, and that's sort of an insight here. It goes back to the lockdown logic. Would you say if it saves grandmother or saves old people, or do you want at some point there is a calculus here that has to be made. And, in general, people choose the opposite things if they're actually given or they'll choose, or in the case of the hospital expenditure at end of life, if properly asked and if they had to pay for it, and the Amish studies bear this out, people will just die peacefully at home rather than taking expensive end of life care. So I think a lot of things could be resolved on an individual level or a family level, or if you want a communal level, maybe a small city state could resolve it. But that city state's going to have violate a lot of liberties to do so, which is fine. But that's a little different here. And your things about birth rates and those things, that's also interesting here. What actually is good public health. So those are my final comments here. It's a bit of a long ending there. But do you have anything to add, Swith? And thanks for doing this episode.
All I would say is, I think you can salvage public health, but you get public health by letting people look after their own health. That would seem to be the obvious thing. You talk about pollution, Well, the thing is with pollution is, well, at least with the pollution argument, you can go, oh no, there's a tort taking place. With lockdowns, it's, well, we think you might be causing a tort to somebody else, so you could better stay in your house. I mean, it just inverted all legal norms to just a breathtaking amount. And on the private sector with like pollution, I mean, Rothbard talks about this in his long essay on pollution and property rights, that in the 19th century, housewives would take factories to court to go, oh, look, you produce lots of smoke, you've dirtied my washing. And the judge would go, yeah, it did, rule in favor of housewife, which Rothbard argues caused the factories to change to a different type of coal, to anthracite coal, which was cleaner burning and didn't cause the problems. And that was fine. And then in the progressive era, the state wanted a rapid industrialization, and so directed judges not to take any notice of this at all, until the point at which they then need to implement minimum stack heights for the chimneys, so that the pollution would go elsewhere. So whilst it could be quite complicated in certain sections, if you have the idea of generally full liability, I mean, maybe not in all cases, but then this could be done with a functioning judicial system. There's no reason why such things couldn't be taken into account. And if you can't get it to a legal standard, you just got to treat it like an act of nature, an act of God, and just deal with it. I mean, the only other thing to do is to create some vast bureaucracy to intervene with the running of things. And also one last thing on health, which relates to fossil fuels. If the governments of the world cared about health, what they would want to do is have maximum energy generation, because it means you'll be able to manipulate the environment such that it is more conducive to human flourishing. And that would mean making nuclear, amongst others, basically legal, as opposed to effectively criminalizing it, which they have done for many, many years. And that would mean that there was more goods and services produced. It would mean hospitals would be able to run cheaper. Old people would be able to heat their homes easily, not die of cold. People would be a lot healthier if there was more energy. But this is just so beyond the sort of Overton window of discussions in the context of health that, I mean, you just get laughed at for making those points. But I do think related to fossil fuels, energy generation is hugely important to health. But no, all things is climate change, otherwise known as something bad happened in the environment. It must be climate change, because it's always changing. But anyway, now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And finally, if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.